Thank you, Kristen. We open our services with the ringing of a chime 3 times. Once to wake the chime, once to open our minds, and once to open our hearts. The invocation this afternoon is by Robert Fulgham. I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history. I believe that dreams are more powerful than facts, that hope always triumphs over experience, that laughter is the only cure for grief, and I believe that love is stronger than death. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Ames, where Dorothy was a member. My name is Kent McCusick, the minister serving this fellowship. My pronouns are he and him. It's my pleasure to welcome you here and an honor to be with you today. We're gathered this afternoon by death, the end of a good person's life, the life of Dorothy J. Kizer, who passed away in November of 2019. 2 years and 7 months is a long time to experience loss without closure. So today, we come together to both grieve and share our joy of having been a part of Dorothy's life. May the memories of this woman who touched our lives many times in many ways continue to fill our lives with the meanings and blessings of love. It is good that we've come together because we need each other in empathy and consolation, because we need each other in courage and wisdom. This is a time to remember the person Dorothy was and to affirm the life that she lived. It is also a time to show our love and support for those who knew her best and loved her the most. Her family, her daughter Dina, her son George and wife Anne, grandchildren Amy Cuellar and husband Mauricio, and Mark Kizer and wife Adrienne. Great-grandchildren Lucas and Sebastian Cuellar and her beloved nieces and nephews. It is good that we have come together because a human life is sacred in being born, in its living, and also in its dying. We gather in celebration of the life of Dorothy J. Kizer. In Unitarian Universalism, it is our practice to light a chalice when we gather in sacred space. Come into this circle of loss. Come into this circle of compassion. Come into this circle of memory. Come into this circle of love. Let us all be strong in the conviction that in spite of death, the scheme of life is ultimately good. The reading this afternoon is The Cost by Dorothy Monroe. Death is not too high a price to pay for having lived. Mountains never die, nor do seas or rocks or endless sky. Through countless centuries of time, they stay eternal, deathless, yet they never live. If choice were there, I would not hesitate to choose mortality. Whatever fate demanded in return for life, I'd give for never to have seen the fertile plains, nor heard the winds, nor felt the warm sun on sands beneath a salty sea, nor touched the hands of those I love. Without these, all the gains of timelessness would not be worth a day of living and of loving, come what may. I invite you into a time of singing, and I invite you to rise in body and or spirit. As we sing, it'll be on the monitor, We Laugh, We Cry, by Shelley Jackson Denham. The lyrics will be on the screen.
We laugh, we cry, we live, we die, we dance, we sing our song. We need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. We need to feel the freedom just to have some time alone. But most of all, we meet close friends we call our very own. And we believe in life and in the strength of love. Yes, we have found a need to be together. We have our hearts hearts to give. We have our thoughts to receive, and we believe that sharing is an answer. We seek an honest answer to the questions of this life. We seek to put an end to all the waste of human strife. We search for truth, equality, and healthy peace of mind. And then we come together here to talk of what we find. And we believe in life and in the strength of love. Yes, we have found a need to be together. We have our hearts to give. We have our thoughts to receive. And we believe that learning is an answer. Yes, we believe in life and in the strength of love. Yes, we have found a need to be together. And in our search for peace, maybe we'll finally see, even to questions truly is our answer.
This afternoon, I'm used to being here mostly in the morning. This afternoon, Dorothy's daughter, Dina, will share some memories of Dorothy's life. Come right up.
Thank you. Mother did not have an easy childhood growing up in rural Oklahoma during the Depression. Her mother had 8 children, but only 3 children survived beyond the age of a toddler. My mother, Dorothy, was the oldest of the 3 surviving children. She had 2 younger sisters, Margie and Mary Alice. When Mother was very young, her father worked as a coal miner. The family lived in company housing built by the Victoria coal mines. Coal mining is often depicted as being a rough, dangerous way of making a living, and it was. But when the coal mines shut down, making a living during the Depression in Oklahoma was even more difficult. The days of working in the coal mines seemed relatively prosperous compared to the harder times that followed. After the coal mines closed, Mother's father tried making a living by farming, but his farm was not very productive, and most people in the community did not have enough money to buy much produce. In addition to farming, he sold furs from animals that he trapped and did any other job he could find. It was a tough time to make a living in rural Oklahoma. Later, my mother's mother, my grandmother, worked as a school cook, and during World War II, she worked in the defense industry building airplanes. She was one of the wartime female workers known as a Rosie the Riveter. She traveled by train to places like Tulsa and Wichita, carrying her tool bag with her. She was proud of her job and took great pains to do her work carefully. As she put it, it's for our boys. When my mother was going to school, her father thought he was being generous by allowing his children to attend school, since he had been forced to work in the cotton mines at a young age growing up in North Carolina. He told the family that when the children were home at school, he expected them to work for the family and do chores around the house and the farm. He would not allow his children to bring homework home. Doing homework was forbidden. Well, my mother's didn't see things the same way as her father. When everyone went to bed at night, she nailed a quilt over the doorway to her bedroom and studied by herself using a kerosene lamp for light. She was determined to do well in school. She saw that as her best opportunity to better her life. She had a plan. Mother was the most determined and strong-willed person I ever met. She kept a diary most of her life. In her diary, Mother discussed the plans she made for herself. Her words revealed her determination. She did not write that she wanted to go to college or that it would be nice to go to college. She wrote matter-of-factly that she would be going to college. It was just a question of how she'd be able to do it. When Mother was in her senior year of high school, prospects for college in her world were bleak. It was the Depression, and parts of Oklahoma were ravaged by the Dust Bowl. Most people in Mother's world were concerned with basic needs like feeding their family. Given the tough circumstances, I think most people would resign themselves to their lot in life and not aspire to college. But Mother was not most people. No one tried harder to go to college than my mother. She did everything she could think of to earn money for college. She went to the small town closest to the family farm and walked up and down each block, knocking on every single door, asking the residents if they needed their house cleaned or if they had any other type of job she could do. She met with various clubs all over the state that might possibly provide a stipend or scholarship for college. She gave speeches to those clubs. She filled out any application she could find that might possibly help with college expenses. She even wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. She wrote Mrs. Roosevelt telling her that she was valedictorian of her class and she would be attending college. However, she needed a job so she could pay for her schooling. She asked Mrs. Roosevelt to help her find a job. In retrospect, it seems kind of naive that my mother would think that Eleanor Roosevelt would take the time to help one young girl in rural Oklahoma when there were millions of people all over the country needing help during the Depression. But my mother's optimism, drive, and single-minded determination paid off. Her letter to Eleanor Roosevelt worked. Several weeks after mailing the letter, she received a job offer in the mail from the federal government's NYA program, the National Youth Administration's work-study program. The job she was offered was to fold bandages for an Indian hospital, and there was a college located nearby. This provided the necessary funding that my mother needed to attend college. She was on her way. Although her family could not provide her with money for college, they provided her with something very valuable. She had a formidable network of sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, neighbors, and friends who loved and cared about her and helped her in any way they could. One of the church groups in her community hosted box suppers to raise money for college expenses. Another women's group in the community made Mother a new quilt to take to college. When Mother left for school, the quilt was not quite finished. So when the quilt was completed, the local highway patrolman was enlisted to deliver the finished quilt to her dorm room. She was the talk of her dorm. Mother's favorite subject in college was chemistry. One of the rules for participating in the NYA program was that students were required to take a certain number of practical courses, such as home economics in my mother's case. The implicit assumption was that the NYA students might not complete their studies, so it would be good if they left school with at least some practical skills. Not only did Mother complete her studies, she excelled. When she graduated with her bachelor's degree, she was offered a number of good jobs. She was offered a job as a chemist. She was offered several teaching positions. She was even offered a job in the military at a rank that was higher than the rank my father had during World War II. Some of the more irreverent relatives commented, Well, that would just make it official. Later in her career, she received a grant from the National Science Foundation for Graduate Studies. She went on to earn her PhD. She had a long and successful career as a teacher, first as a high school teacher and later as a college professor. Mother dreamed a life bigger than circumstances provided for her. Though Mother had many challenges, through her sheer determination and intelligence, she lived the life she dreamed of. She made her dreams come true. I am so proud of my mother. I will always be inspired by her example. My parents married during World War II, and like many young couples during that time period, their life was filled with uncertainty, not knowing if the young soldiers would come home from war. My father enlisted on a Tuesday, and on the following Saturday, my parents were married. My mother's wedding gown was a blue twill dress that she made in her home economics class. When my brother was a toddler and money was scarce, the blue twill wedding dress became a blue twill suit for my brother, beautifully sewn by my mother. I guess my parents' marriage worked out okay. They were married for 70 years. I was blessed. My mother was kind and devoted. She put tremendous energy, effort, and care into motherhood. My brother and I never lacked for attention. As a child, I took this for granted. It was only later that I realized not every child was so lucky. Mother loved her family. She loved her husband, her sisters, her nieces, her nephews, and later her grandchildren. She was proud of her family. There was nothing she liked better than to brag on her family. She would go on and on about someone, no matter how embarrassing it was to the person being bragged about. She was a great storyteller and a world-class talker. She could recount stories from her earlier life in vivid detail, prompting a laugh-out-loud response. Once she started talking, you couldn't get a word in edgewise, but then the stories were so entertaining and funny that you really didn't care. Mother lived a remarkable life. She was a force. She was full of life and high-spirited. She was determined and strong-willed. She never doubted for a minute that she could accomplish what she set out to do. She was a bright light. She was good company. She was funny and entertaining and loved to socialize with her family and friends. She was intelligent, analytical, and introspective in ways most people didn't realize. Her life is one that deserves to be remembered. Without a doubt, it was a life well lived, and I miss her every day.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Dina. That was, you hit so many words that come to mind when I think of your mom. She always sat, I can see her back there. And when I would get in the pulpit, I would see her there and I'd say, there's going to be a good story come to me at the end of the service. And we'd stand right there and I'd greet people. And Dorothy would stop and talk and talk and talk. I see you remember this. And Dina, after a while, would always take her hand and go, now come now, Mother, we need to leave. There are people waiting to see Reverend Kent. But she did dig her heels in a few times, but I loved having the opportunity to know her a little, and you too. If you would like to share a memory that you have of Dorothy this morning, please come forward to this microphone, introduce yourself, and share your story. This is a time of sharing.
Hello, my name is Janice Goins, and Dorothy was my mother's favorite cousin. They shared a birthday, and growing up, they had birthday parties together. And hearing Dina talk about Dorothy's struggles to go to college, that was the story my mother told. I have 3 sisters, the 4 of us. Mother talked about Dorothy constantly because Dorothy was her role model. She wanted her girls to be like Dorothy, and she became our role model. And I had the good fortune in later life, after my children were in university, to have a job opportunity in New York City. I didn't know anyone there, and after I got settled, I thought, well, I do know one person in New York City. It's my cousin Dina. And I gave Dina a call. We had not seen each other in decades, but we became very dear friends. And I was reacquainted with my role model, Dorothy. And Dina and I have had the pleasure of sharing Dorothy's later years together with her. And I'm so happy to be here to celebrate Dorothy's life. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Jenny Huntington. I'm really glad to hear more about Dorothy's life. Dorothy and I traveled the same path very briefly. I was a graduate, when we moved to Ames, I went back to Iowa State and was a graduate student in home economics. And Dorothy, I think, was just finishing her doctorate at that time. So we ran into each other at church and were surprised because the 2 of us were what they called in those days non-traditional students. They didn't really know what to do with us or to call us. And I didn't know just how non-traditional Dorothy was, but she was. So we kind of would touch base when we run into each other on Sunday and see how things were going. And I was just getting started. And Dorothy told me that she'd finished and she was interviewing for jobs. And the offer that she had that she was going to take was at a school in the South. And George was going to stay here. And I thought, well, how would that work out, you know? And I had children at home, young children at home, and I was going to school. And I could only hope that I could find a job locally when I finished. But here Dorothy went off. She said, I'm going to take it. And she went off and taught in a, I don't know, was this a traditionally Black school? Yes. Yeah. And she taught home economics, and I am sure inspired her students. She seemed like a sweet, slightly Southern lady, and she was tough as nails. I'm sure sometimes I imagine what it might have been like to be a student of hers. I do thank Dorothy for the path that she followed, because in some ways it made my path easier and clearer. And I was lucky to know her.
I'm Carol McRae. I'm one of her nieces. My mother was her baby sister. And my mother was very proud of the fact that Aunt Dorothy, she went to junior college, which is now a university at Cameron, Oklahoma, and the Cameron University. It was a junior college, and she set the highest score, and I think it was in science, that they had ever had. And then she went to Oklahoma State, but she was a wonderful aunt, and we have wonderful memories. But Mother was so proud that she set the record. And it was her determination.
Hello, I'm Tammy Bolton, and I was George and Dorothy's neighbor, so their next door neighbor. I moved in, and how we got to know each other was interesting because they had some bad neighbors before I moved in, but I didn't know that. And so George, he was outside in the yard, so I would talk to George. But one day, and I hadn't met Dorothy yet, but one day I put my leaves where they shouldn't go on the other side of the fence. And so I got, funny thing, George came and he brought me a very well-worded letter from Dorothy about the leaves. And so it was eloquently written, very good. But it was funny that we hadn't met yet, but I had talked to George multiple times. Well, then my kids dressed up for Halloween, and we did May baskets and stuff. So then we got to know Dorothy, and so because we weren't like the previous neighbors, then we got to be really good friends, and it was a pleasure to know Dorothy very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your sharing. I invite you into a time of musical meditation as Kristen plays Somewhere Over the Rainbow. In your order of service, on the left side, there's a responsive reading called We Remember Dorothy. Your part is in bold. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember her. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember her. In the opening of buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember her. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember her. In the rustling of leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember her. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember her. When the colors of the sky cause our eyes to be lifted up, we remember her. When the music brings us joy and touches our hearts, we remember her. When times are hard and we search for courage and hope, we remember her. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember her. So long as we live, Dorothy Kizer too shall live, for she is now a part of us as we remember Dorothy. Let's be together in a moment of silence. It's good to be together. To close this service, I offer the words of Kenneth W. Collier. I do not know where we go when we die, and I do not know what the soul is, or what death is, or when, or why. But what I do know is that the song once sung cannot be unsung, and the life once lived cannot be unlived, and the love once loved cannot be unloved. After we hear a postlude, I ask that you remain seated until the family moves into the fireside room where they will greet you in a reception line. Thank you for coming together to celebrate the life of Dorothy Kizer, and thank you for being here today. Peace. Kristen.